Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today we're going to talk about family history myths. There are a lot of them that get circulated frequently. Some of them are more common than others, and we'll talk about a few of the most common ones. And some of them are just really particular to your family. Stories that have been passed down that for whatever reason get perpetuated and sometimes grow or morph as time goes by, just like a good game of telephone. But we'll talk about some ways to get to the heart of some of those stories and to find out the truth, because hopefully as genealogists, that's what we are interested in, is truth. So with that introduction, let's dive in. Let me just share with you a few family history myths that have come up in my own family. Right there at the top, this is my third great-grandfather, and a story was passed down that that his wife worked for Abraham Lincoln, and we thought that was kind of cool, but we had to prove that out. We had to look for the details behind that story. I have several other relatives where stories were passed down that their name was changed at Ellis Island, and in many cases, they changed their own names after they got to this country, or they didn't come through Ellis Island at all. That's always fun. And then this is my grandfather. The story has often been told about his Native American heritage, and so that's a big story that gets told in a lot of families. So let's just talk about a few of these. I don't share this information to discourage anyone or to call your grandmother a liar. That's certainly not my intention. However, it's important to recognize that many of these myths have roots in real information, and we hope to get to the truth of that information. And so this will just help that process along a little bit. So let's talk about the first myth, which is, let's talk about names being changed at Ellis Island. If you've ever told that story or been told that story, let me just give you some facts that might help you understand a little bit better why this gets perpetuated. First of all, passenger lists were created by the ship's captain before the ship ever left its port of origin. Passenger lists were not created at Ellis Island. And so whatever's written on that passenger list came with them across the sea, wasn't created here. For the period of time when Ellis Island was in operation, which began in 1892, so if your ancestor came before 1892, they didn't come through Ellis Island, but for the period of immigration that started with Ellis Island in 1892, there was paperwork required. There were documents. Immigration had a process. There were laws involved, just like there are now. And that paperwork was typically completed in the immigrant's hometown by a city clerk. So it was somebody who spoke the language, somebody who knew these people. And the ship, when they got on the ship, the people there, the employees there, were very careful to check that paperwork. Because if they got to Ellis Island and the paperwork was not in order, if they weren't immigrating appropriately with the appropriate documents, then they were sent home. And it did happen. The problem is they were sent home at the shipping company's expense. And so it was in the shipping company's best interest to make sure before they ever left their country of origin that the paperwork was in order. And then when the immigrants got to Ellis Island, there were immigration inspectors there who checked the paperwork and checked the passenger lists and made sure everything was in order before they let them into the country. Those inspectors were usually foreign-born native speakers of the language that the immigrants spoke. Dozens of languages were accounted for at Ellis Island by the clerks, and so people were typically directed to someone who spoke the same language that they spoke. And if there was an obscure language, oftentimes the staff at Ellis Island would hire temporary employees or bring in temporary clerks to help process those passengers who spoke a language that wasn't accounted for on a regular basis. So it wasn't a matter of a misunderstanding or the name not being heard or understood correctly, because those people were typically foreign-born native speakers of that language. Now, that doesn't mean that your ancestor didn't change their name. What we find most commonly is that the people Americanized themselves within just a few years after arriving in this country. They wanted to fit in. Certain ethnicities or certain countries of origin had different prejudices against them at different periods of time, so they may have altered their name to make it sound more American or to make it sound more of some other kind of an ethnicity, depending on the sentiment of the time. But having a name changed at Ellis Island didn't really happen all that often, if at all. I've never seen a documented case of that. So another myth that comes up quite a bit is that you're related to someone famous. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about this other than it's exciting to find somebody famous or infamous in your family tree, simply for the fact that their lives are really well documented. And that's always exciting to have that. But there are just a couple of words of caution that I want to offer you. First, not everyone with the same surname is related. Just because you have a Bradford in your family tree doesn't mean your family came over on the Mayflower. Or just because you have a Boone in your family tree doesn't mean that you're related to Daniel Boone. That said, you may be related, but you might not be a descendant. And so be really careful when you share some of those stories. Unfortunately, people who know better sometimes don't treat those who don't know better very well. But an example is George Washington. George Washington has no known descendants, meaning nobody descends directly from him. Nobody has him as a great whatever grandfather. However, if I remember correctly, he has uncles and cousins who have descendants. So you may be related to George Washington, but not a descendant of George Washington. Hopefully that makes sense. And so there may be some truth in that story, like there is some truth in all of these stories probably. Also, just keep in mind, you double the number of surnames in your tree every generation. Every generation you go back, those men married someone who had a different last name, or those women married someone who had a different last name, and now all of a sudden you've got more surnames. And so don't get hung up on one particular surname. There's plenty of stuff to discover about the people in your family tree. And you may be related to someone famous, just not the way you think you are, or not on the line that you might think. Okay, the next one, and this is a big one, and this was the place where I was concerned about offending the most people. There are a lot of myths and a lot of stories and a lot of family suppositions and a lot of pride that goes into telling people that you have Native American ancestry. As I mentioned, it has often been related to me by various people in my family that my grandfather had Native American blood, that he was, I've heard at various times, a quarter or an eighth or a 16th Native American. And we take great pride in that for some reason. We live in a day and age where that's a big deal. Not too many years ago, it was a source of shame for some people and a source of embarrassment for some people because of some of the prejudices and the sentiments in various parts of this country. And so a lot of times it was hidden, and now that hidden stuff is coming out. And so let's just keep in mind some facts as you approach your research looking to prove or disprove that Native American ancestry. First of all, and I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but Native Americans don't have princesses. So if the story is that your ancestress was a Native American princess, it always seems to be a Cherokee princess, that is probably not true. As a matter of fact, that is not true. Now, there are various words in different Native American dialects where that word could translate as a cherished wife or an honored woman in the tribe, but they don't have princesses. At one point in history, that was actually a little bit of a racial slur. So if there was any kind of an intermarriage or an interracial relationship, and not even always with Native Americans, sometimes it was if that relationship was with an African American woman, they would call her a Native American princess as a type of racial slur. And so, again, I don't say that to offend anyone, but I hope that you recognize that just like a game of telephone, if you remember that game from your childhood, where one person says something and whispers it into the ear of the next person, who whispers it into the ear of the next person, and by the time it gets 3 or 4 or 10 or 12 people down the line, that story that phrase has morphed into something completely different than what the original intent was. So just keep that in mind. I hear this a lot. Well, I've looked at a picture of my ancestor and they have dark hair and high cheekbones, and so I'm convinced that they're Native American. That is not enough evidence of Indian ancestry. There are other ethnicities that display some of those same physical traits. So one of my cautions to you is, don't get so hung up on your stories about your family history that you're not open to discovering the truth. If you get so locked into your ideas about what your ancestry is or is not, then when the truth reveals itself through DNA, through the paper trail, through documentation that you discover as you go, you might dismiss that out of hand or be offended or think it's wrong because you weren't open enough to discover the truth. And so just beware. Other ethnicities display some of those same physical characteristics. So it's not a definitive thing. I found this little statistic interesting, and just to give you an idea of how prevalent this myth is in a lot of places. If you look at recent Census Bureau records, so the actual census records haven't been released, but the data behind it has been. And the Census Bureau reports that there are 4.9 million people in the United States who self-identify on the census form where you can check your race. They self-identify as Native American. However, according to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there are only 1.9 million people enrolled in federally recognized tribes in the United States, and there are hundreds of them. So I mean, it's not that's the limitation. So there are a lot of people who connect with Native American ancestry, who look to it, who have an affinity for it, but whether or not that blood actually runs through their veins, or whether or not they have an ancestor or a group of ancestors or a branch of their family tree who were ever Native American, you may or may not be able to prove, depending on what documentation is available. So just, like I said, just keep that in mind. Okay, one or two more here. This is a big one that comes up a lot in family history, especially for newbies, and it always makes me cringe a little bit when I hear people getting tattoos of their family coat of arms. I think you're putting that on your body in a permanent way, and it's kind of a lie. There is no such thing as a family coat of arms. Coats of arms were assigned to individuals, and they are, to this day in Europe, governed by heraldry registries and by a very strict process where upon the death of somebody who has a coat of arms, their heir, who is usually the oldest son, can apply for permission to display that same coat of arms. That person, it's not like that person's all his sons get to display it. Only one. Because that coat of arms at any given time only belongs to one specific individual. And so then somebody else, like multiple sons in a family will have different coats of arms. That's possible. And so really, a coat of arms only belongs to one individual at a time, and it only gets passed down through one particular line of the family. So just because you have a surname and somebody with that surname once had a coat of arms does not mean that is the family coat of arms, because there's no such thing. So with that said, let me just share with you a couple of ways to get to the heart of your family stories, ways to prove or disprove. I have a longer version of this in a webinar that you can find in the Learning Center. We're just going to breeze through some of these pretty quickly in the 5 or 10 minutes that we have left here. So my first piece of advice to you is collect all versions of the story. I have a picture there of us sitting around a table at my grandmother's house, and that's how family stories often get perpetuated, is in a family environment when stories are being told and passed on and passed around. And do you remember when? So remember or think about when you heard the story, where you heard the story, what the circumstances of that were. Talking to family members together is a good thing, because memories start to flow and information starts to flow, but also talk to family members separately. It's interesting, if you separate your grandmother, she may say, we kind of embellished that a little bit, or, your grandfather's been telling that story for years, but really here's what happened. So be willing to not just talk to people together, but also separately as well. Probe for details, really kind of ask a lot of questions and ask for really specifics about the story and about when and where they heard the story. Also think outside of the immediate family box. Oftentimes we think, well, I have to go to the oldest living family member, so I'm going to go talk to Aunt Sally, or I'm going to talk to my mom, or whatever. But if the story comes from a family that's back 2 or 3 generations, an ancestor that's, a 3rd or 4th great grandfather, they have hundreds, sometimes thousands of descendants. Look for some of those 3rd and 4th cousins and see how the story came down in their branch of the family. See what other versions exist of that story. What's happening is you're collecting all the versions of that story so that you can figure out which pieces of it are true. Now, this is a little bit more difficult for some of us, and I include myself in that. We need to be willing to be objective and to recognize that we're creating our family history. We're documenting that. We're building a family tree. And if we're chasing down lines of our family tree or information or just attaching stuff that's not really who our family, then we're not really being honest about that. And it's not really a true representation of who we are and who our family was. And so be willing to just be objective and to seek whatever truth is out there. So here are just some of the ways that I do this for myself. I ask some of these questions to myself. What if this story was not true? What if you've been told your whole life that you have Native American ancestry, but that was not true? What if? Does that change how you see yourself? Does that change who you are? Does that change your perception about your family? Just be willing to be uncomfortable maybe with that just a little bit, but ask yourself that question, because what I've found is when I ask myself that question, it puts me in a proper frame of mind to then go out and figure out what the truth is. And sometimes I discover that the story is true, or that a piece of the story is true. Think about what things you can immediately prove or disprove. So, for example, I keep going back to Native American ancestry because it's an easy one, but let's use Ellis Island. We talked about that earlier. If you have a family story that your ancestor's name was changed at Ellis Island, but your ancestor immigrated in 1874, you can immediately disprove part of that story because Ellis Island wasn't in operation until 1892. If you prove that your grandmother always said she was Native American, but you've just discovered that all 4 of her grandparents were immigrants into this country, well, you've just disproven immediately that story or that part of that story. So then start to think about what parts of the story could be true. What parts of the story, maybe it's not Native American ancestry, maybe that didn't happen, but maybe one of the uncles married a Native American woman, and that's how that story of Native American ancestry got passed down. Really, it was, your grandmother had cousins who were Native American because her uncle married a Native American woman, and now all of a sudden we have that in the family, just not in your direct ancestry. And then think about how the story might have changed over time. How might it have morphed? How might it have been passed down? How might it have been exaggerated for storytelling effect? And try to just get down to some of the bare bones of the story, again, because those are the facts that you're going to be able to prove or disprove. Step 3, and this is hopefully what you do with all of your family history research, but document. Find out everything you can about the person or people involved in the story. Use all those standard genealogical records to document their life. And just work your way back one generation at a time. Find out everything you can also, and this is a piece that sometimes new genealogists don't know about or don't think about. Find out everything you can about the historical events and people or places tied to the story. So in my family, I have a sneaking suspicion. My grandfather, who has dark hair and high cheekbones, grew up in the northwest corner of Arkansas, just over the border from Indian Territory. And so while we have not yet proven Native American ancestry in his family tree, there was a lot of interaction with people in Indian Territory, which was what most of all of Oklahoma, some of that area, was called before it became a state. And so maybe your ancestor was born in Indian Territory, that doesn't make them Indian. But you would learn that if you learned a little bit about the history of the place and how it was settled and when and where and why. So spend some time getting to know that. There are a lot of really great resources for that. The first one I would recommend is the Ancestry.com wiki. You're going to find that under the Learning Center at the top of your Ancestry toolbar. You just hover over that and click on Family History Wiki, and that will take you to a place where you can search. You can search by state. You can search by record type. You can search by historical event, do some research to discover what pieces of those story are true or not. And then just a little bonus step for you, and this one is sometimes a little bit more difficult, but don't be afraid to tell the true story once you discover it. Be prepared for people who will disagree. We have a little bit of a family myth circulating in our family right now about the legitimacy or illegitimacy of certain members of our family that are pretty close to us, actually. And so when we try to correct that information, there are people who still argue with us or who still disagree with us. Just be prepared for that, and recognize that you don't have to make a big deal out of it everywhere. But maybe look for some fun new ways to tell the family story or to get it out there so that people who come after you will be able to have an avenue to find the truth if those myths get perpetuated. So just some ideas. You can write a blog post or a series of blog posts about your ancestor, about what you've discovered about them. You can publish a book. There's a publish button right there on your Ancestry.com home screen. You can publish just a little book about the stories that you found and the documentation that you found, and you can disseminate copies of that to various branches or members of the family. You can put together a slideshow or some other way to create images of those documents and show it at the next family reunion. Tell your side of the story. One of the suggestions that came in from one of our users that I love is, if you found out your family history and you shared it with your grandfather, it's his family maybe, and he was excited about it. When you put together that slideshow, let him narrate it, because now you're not just telling the story, but it's being told in the voice of somebody who may be a little bit more respected or a little bit older in the family, and sometimes that has a little bit more impact. So just be willing to share that information, so that when the next generation comes along, if they hear that family myth, at least there will be some evidence that there's another story or more to the story out there somewhere. So that's it. Hopefully that's helpful for you. We talked about a few myths that can be immediately dispelled or that should be immediately questioned as we dig into our family history. Hopefully you got some information out of some of the ways that we can tell those family stories a little bit better or collect the truth, get to the truth. Like all family history work, sometimes we just have to go one generation at a time, one document at a time, plucking away, trying to put the truth together. It's a little bit like a puzzle or a good mystery, but we get to the truth. And when we get to the truth, then hopefully we're sharing those stories with our family, because at least in my experience, the truth is sometimes far, far better and a lot more exciting than some of the myths that get passed around. That's all we have time for today. If you have any questions, I will be on chat just for a few minutes. I've only got a few minutes today. If you're watching this live, if you're watching an archived version of this on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment. We do read and respond to those as they come in. You can also email me at ask@ancestry.com if you have specific questions or challenges in your research. I read through all of those, and we use those to put together the calendar for our events. With that said, our February calendar is complete and is available online on our Facebook page. Just click on the events tab. You can see all of the topics for the month of February and RSVP for those ones that might be of interest to you. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.